Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Samwick, and I'm a professor of economics and director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the third of our centennial lectures. During 2008, we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of the birth of Nelson Rockefeller, a member of the Dartmouth College class of 1930, with a series of lectures and events that showcase his policy legacy and his political impact. This afternoon, I am thrilled to introduce renowned historian Richard Norton Smith to speak to us about the surprising Nelson Rockefeller. To have Mr. Smith here as we celebrate the centennial is something for which we used to thank serendipity. But today I'm going to thank Google. In doing my research for the centennial, you can imagine that at some point I would have gone to that little search box and entered into it the phrase biography of Nelson Rockefeller. Somewhere between the 20th and the 30th link that Google gives you is a web page from 2006 announcing Mr. Smith's arrival as a scholar in residence in the departments of History and Art History and the School of Public Policy at George Mason University. And the very last paragraph starts out, while at Mason, Smith will complete a biography of Nelson Rockefeller. Mr. Smith is a leading presidential historian. He has been the director of several presidential museums and libraries, most recently the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois. He appears regularly on C-SPAN and the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. His many books include An Uncommon Man, The Triumph of Herbert Hoover, The Harvard Century, The Making of a University to a Nation, and Patriarch, George Washington and the New American Nation. His book, Thomas E. Dewey and His Times, was a finalist for the 1983 Pulitzer Prize. The common thread connecting all of his work is to make history alive and relevant for a mass audience. If he holds true to form on his Rockefeller project, I predict a solid improvement in his Google page ranking. In the writing of a biography, sometimes the author finds the subject, and sometimes, even years after he has passed away, the subject finds the author. And so it has been with Nelson Rockefeller and Richard Norton Smith, who at the age of 14 earned his way to the Republican National Convention in Miami Beach, where he saw Richard Nixon's Southern strategy eclipse Nelson Rockefeller for the party's presidential nomination. Some years later, after graduating from Harvard in 1975, Smith worked as an intern in the White House of President Ford. As Smith describes it, your life is intertwined with the political figures of your day. This is the book he was born to write. We are very fortunate to get a preview this afternoon. On behalf of the Rockefeller Center and the College Republicans, please join me in welcoming Richard Norton Smith.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a very generous introduction. He didn't tell you the full story of the '68 convention, which I'm waiting to write myself, but I can tell you this. The fact is, I was 14. I was in Miami. I was in the floor demonstration for Governor Rockefeller, and I had been doing my delegate calculations almost every hour, and had concluded we weren't going to make it, mostly because Ronald Reagan wasn't holding up his end of the deal with the Southern delegates. And so anyway, my contribution to that year's political violence took place when we marched right through the Iowa delegation full of a bunch of stolid farmers for Nixon, and one of whom I remember striking over the head with my sign. And it didn't get us any extra votes in Iowa, but it felt awfully good at the time. Anyway, I can't tell you how honored I am to be part of this centennial celebration, how flattered I am that Mrs. Rockefeller and other members of the Rockefeller family are here. And of course, the 25th anniversary of the other Rockefeller Center. I kept looking for Prometheus, but anyway, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine a better living memorial to Governor Rockefeller than what you are all doing. And I congratulate you on doing it, and doing it as well as you are. It's a wonderful legacy. It is hard to believe that almost 50 years have passed since the second floor of the New York State Capitol in Albany, first echoed to the rasping command, "I'm not interested in what I can't do. I want to know how I can do what I want to do, and it's your job to tell me how." Or bestowing compliments so lavish as to devalue the vocabulary of praise. Terrific, fantastic, and the all-purpose fabulous. For a biographer, Nelson Rockefeller is a fabulous feast of character, a human whirlwind whose energy was exceeded only by his curiosity. To his longtime personal aide, Joe Canzeri, he was the force. To just about everyone whose path he crossed, he was a force to be reckoned with. As with any historian, I'm interested not only in what Nelson Rockefeller produced, but in what produced Nelson Rockefeller. We heard yesterday from Governor Whitman comparing him to Teddy Roosevelt, which was a very apt, I think, analogy. I would go further back in American history. I think Nelson Rockefeller stands squarely in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton, that other quintessential New Yorker whose financial wizardry gave life to the new republic, even as it defied the agrarian virtues enshrined in Jeffersonian dogma. A nation builder rejected by the very people he capitalized, Hamilton seems a fitting progenitor to the man who called moral obligation bonding the greatest system ever invented, and whose legacy to New Yorkers included both the largest state university in America and the taxes to pay for it. But there is another, more poignant reason to link Hamilton and his 20th century counterpart. Quite simply, in some quarters, Nelson Rockefeller is out of fashion. In this, he resembles no one more than Hamilton, the Flying Dutchman of American politics, who is scorned by the left for his alleged aristocratic tendencies and abused by the right for his faith in government capitalism. Life is lived forward, yet history all too often is told backwards. That is, looking over our shoulders, colored by intervening events and the all too conventional thinking of subsequent generations. There's a word for this. The word is hindsight. Nelson Rockefeller ought to be understood within the tradition of activist government that for most of the 20th century made New York State a hothouse of innovation. Instead, he is usually glimpsed in retrospect through the distorting lens of the so-called Reagan Revolution. That New York in the mid-1960s should spend more on fighting water pollution than the federal government spent nationwide is viewed by Robert Taft's philosophical descendants as overreaching, unless, of course, you happen to live along the reclaimed Hudson River. That the Empire State, in those days it still was the Empire State, should lead the way with the first state arts council in America, not to mention pioneering programs in mass transit, urban housing, labor law, mental health, aid to private education, nursing homes, consumer protection, even a mandatory seatbelt law, and no-fault auto insurance. All this offends readers of National Review or Human Events, but no more so than Nelson Rockefeller did in life. Indeed, for most such ideologues, the 7 most dangerous words in the English language are his 1970 fourth campaign, re-election slogan, "He's done a lot, he'll do even more." This is ironic, given the newfound emphasis placed on grassroots activism mandated by Reagan and other recent presidents. Consider the most successful governors of recent times, from Christy Whitman to Arnold Schwarzenegger. They do not hesitate to use market forces or, where necessary, direct intervention by government to satisfy voter demands for better schools, more affordable health care, and cleaner air and water. This alone suggests to me why there has never been a better time to revisit the Rockefeller era, tapping newly available papers and the recollections of a fast, dwindling band of associates in order to reintroduce this great thundering paradox of a man. I said paradox, and this talk is entitled The Surprising Nelson Rockefeller. Most people tend to think of Governor Rockefeller as a monolithic figure. I mean, physically, he looked monolithic. He looked like he was carved from granite. You know, he's one-man Mount Rushmore. But there was nothing really monolithic about Nelson Rockefeller. I've never encountered a historical figure. I've never written about anyone who is more nearly a composite of his mother and his father, first of all. He was an unabashed visionary who was simultaneously the most contemporary of leaders. It is no accident that his public career blossomed during the expansive post-war era, or that his governorship reached its apogee in the early 1960s, when most New Yorkers shared their governor's confident belief that there was no such thing as an insoluble challenge. I love people, he once said. I love solving problems. Most people wish they would go away. Then they would rather go play bridge or poker, which is really creating new problems. I'd rather solve real problems. Left unsaid was the possibility that some solutions could spawn problems of their own. Immediately after his first election in 1958, Rockefeller established over 40 task forces to subject New York's shortcomings to a battery of experts. Now, this really was a sequel. He'd been doing this all his life. Just a couple years earlier, of course, he was the spearhead behind the Special Studies Project, funded by the Rockefeller brothers, but really very much Nelson's idea, that was created to analyze America and its future at mid-century. We finally had to quit, one aide to the governor conceded. The legislature was getting indigestion. As time would demonstrate, not every problem was solvable, at least not through study commissions, bond issues, and goodwill. Irrational, even destructive as it was, some people took drugs, while others profited from their weakness. His enthusiasm matched by his impatience, Nelson Rockefeller was undeterred. I'm optimistic about South America, he had remarked to an interviewer during his days as FDR's Latin American coordinator. But you'll have to qualify that, he went on, by saying, I'm optimistic about everything. While his optimism might be unlimited, the state's resources were not. In a sense, his relative eclipse mirrors that of his Democratic counterpart and admirer, Lyndon Johnson, whose great society was equally ambitious and immune to doubt. Yet Johnson at least had the foresight to bequeath thousands of hours of mostly flattering tape recordings to attest to his mastery of the political process. Governor Rockefeller left no such legacy. After a frustrating, bittersweet turn as Gerald Ford's vice president, he all but withdrew from the public arena. A generation later, the very phrase Rockefeller Republican strikes many on the right as an oxymoron. Yet, most Americans remain pragmatic problem solvers at heart, suspicious of extremes and appreciative of diversity. In short, Nelson Rockefeller's kind of people. Born to vast wealth, he wanted more than anything else to be, in the phrase of his Latin kindred spirits, an authentic representative of the people. In his early campaigns, he affected a battered old hat, reminiscent of FDR's fedora. His baggy pants and unflattering double-breasted suits. By the way, I have to say that among the many things that Mrs. Rockefeller was credited with was improving her husband's wardrobe. They were of a piece with his cast-iron stomach and indiscriminate fondness for Ratner's Deli and Coney Island hot dogs. But at night he went home to a 32-room triplex on Fifth Avenue with a living room fireplace decorated by Henri Matisse. And the maitre d' at the 21 Club had a standing order to notify him whenever the menu featured whitebait. Perspective is as important to historians as to artists, even if the latter are permitted to be non-objective and the former are not. With the perspective of time, what appears contradictory about Nelson Rockefeller becomes much less so, if we see him not as a politician who collected art, but as a frustrated artist who turned to public service to gratify his creative instincts. This is how his brother Lawrence put it on the occasion of Nelson's 70th birthday. Statesmanship and artistic ability have one important characteristic in common: the capacity for making order out of chaos. The principal difference is that an artist works with paint and canvas, and a statesman works with people in terms of their political, social, and economic problems. Erich Fromm might have had Nelson Rockefeller in mind when defining the necessary conditions for human creativity, quote, to be puzzled, to concentrate, to accept conflict and tension, to be born every day, to feel a sense of self. What an artist imagines, an architect implements. Rockefeller did both. Coveting talent, the way other men crave wealth or status, he collected paintings and people with equal enthusiasm. Sometimes they overlapped. On learning of a staff member who doubled as an abstract painter, the governor asked how the man came by his ability. Told that it welled up from inside, from a self-expression demanding release, a dejected Rockefeller responded, "That's how I felt, but I could never do anything about it." It would be more accurate to say that his entire public life was an exercise in doing something about it. If unable to create art himself, he could patronize the gifted, marshaling brains and unparalleled resources to transform public environments and public policy. His old friend and collaborator, the architect Wally Harrison, understood this very well. "He's like a perfect engine," said Harrison of Rockefeller. "It starts acting up if you don't keep it right in the groove of creating something." Being a Rockefeller, he learned early to disarm the other fellow by playing against type. Precisely because his public aspirations were anything but modest, he willingly, almost eagerly confided to journalists an allegedly low IQ. This did not prevent him from establishing a National Commission on Critical Choices or installing himself as its chair. From this lofty perch, he spoke casually of polling the world. For good measure, he added, "I'd like to get Mao Zedong or one of his henchmen to prepare a paper on the nature of man." If he did, someone else would have to write the invitation or at least spell Mao's name. Once, learning of an impending trip to China by Henry Kissinger, he asked his friend to take a message to Mr. Zhou Enlai, Joenlie. Now, dyslexia. Nelson Rockefeller was a dyslexic. He never heard the term until he was 50 years old. He spent most of his life believing that he had a low IQ. Why is that important? It's important for a number of reasons. First of all, he was convinced, and he demonstrated it every day, that through sheer concentration he could overcome this handicap. I've talked to any number of people. It was very characteristic of the governor each night to leave his office with a thick briefcase full of paperwork, and it would all be returned the next day, all read with notes. Now, it also, another form of discipline, it forced the New York State workforce to write one-page memos, which is something that probably should be enforced in every government. But I've lost my train of thought. Yes. Dyslexia was very important in another way. God, I'm having a senior moment. I tell you. No, dyslexia was very important in another way that I think you can argue both ways. His mother, who was an enormous influence in his life, a classic life enhancer, today she'd be the politician in the family, the office holder. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller told all of her children, "You should always surround yourselves with people who are smarter than you." And that was a family trait in a lot of ways. In some ways, it goes back to Senior. He said when he got into the philanthropy business, he told Junior, "We have the money, what we lack are the men." So Rockefellers always were in the business of seeking out the best talent, the best minds, if you will. The problem with that is that works. That's the way to do an organization if what you want to do is eliminate hookworm in the South. Or pursue some other, medical or scientific breakthrough. It's probably not the best way to run for president. And the fact is, when Nelson Rockefeller trusted his gut instincts, he tended to do better than when he listened to all of these shiny, expensive, sometimes self-important best minds who surrounded him. In that sense, I think dyslexia. But the other thing is, in a very small way, dyslexia has contributed to the distortion of his historical image. One example, he was in favor of universal health care in the 1950s. I mean, talk about being ahead of the curve. And as governor, he had come up with a formula that he was very excited about, and he went around the state. He was a great salesman. You know, he invented the town hall meeting. When you see all these politicians today running for office or holding office, and they have town hall meetings, that was Nelson Rockefeller's idea. He absolutely excelled in that format. Because he loved to talk policy, and he was that rare politician who, first of all, could take policy and personalize it, take it apart, make it real, make it relevant, and connect with people. The problem was his dyslexia. So he's got this great new health care program, and he wants to try to pitch it to his audience. And the problem is the quote has been taken out of context for 40 years and cited endlessly to suggest Rockefeller's distance from how real people live. Well, it's very simple. He said, now imagine you're a family of four. And now this is in the late 50s, early 60s. Imagine you're a family of four, and you know, you're living on a typical average income of $100,000. Well, first the audience burst into laughter, which he didn't quite understand. The problem was he transposed the numbers. The text, I've seen the text. The text says $10,000. And he was too, proud, to whatever, in effect, to correct the record. Very small point, but things like that get picked up. They get encrusted like barnacles, you know, on the ship of history. I've chosen to call my talk this afternoon The Surprising Nelson Rockefeller. I could just as easily have called it Nelson, We Hardly Knew Ye. Rockefeller is conventionally portrayed as someone who, if not imprisoned by his wealth, was emotionally stilted by it. The reality is far more complex. If no humanitarian in the conventional sense, he could be and was deeply moved by the plight of society's victims. As a young man, he had decried his family's oil company for distancing itself from the Latin Americans it both employed and exploited. Flying over the blasted landscape of the South Bronx one day in a helicopter, he looked down and muttered, "There's no excuse for people to have to live like that." In 1968, he created something called the Urban Development Corporation, rammed it through the legislature on the day of Martin Luther King's funeral. It was a characteristically sweeping attempt to blend compassion, social engineering, creative financing, and not least of all, eye-catching architecture. For many, the violent storming of Attica State Prison in September 1971 confirmed the impression of Rockefeller as a leader hardened to suffering. In fact, the incident left him scarred for life. 2 days after the assault, which resulted in the deaths of 43 prisoners and guards, someone complimented the governor on his tie. Red, he mused in response, the hangman's color. Far more sensitive than his public image, Rockefeller described his childhood anguish standing before his assembled family each morning, clutching one of the Bible verses scrawled out by his mother and stumbling over the words his brain transposed. Like many dyslexics, he developed a compensating sensitivity to his surroundings and to those who inhabited them. In the popular mind, Governor Rockefeller is habitually classified as his mother's son, understandably. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller's legacy to her favorite child was an ebullient embrace of new people, new ideas, and new forms of expression, especially artistic expression. And yet, Abby's own religion of good works could be every bit as demanding as the more orthodox piety of her husband. "I am eager that you shall be much above the ordinary in character and achievement," she wrote to Nelson when he was 15. "The world needs fine men. There is great work to be done. I want you to train yourself to meet every opportunity, whatever the future may hold in store for you." By the same token, I think at least the conventional picture does an injustice to Mr. Jr., as Nelson's father was called, mostly behind his back. For it was the second, John D. Rockefeller, who initiated the family tradition of studying a problem to death or solution, and whose compulsion to build rivaled that of the ancient pharaohs. Think of the other Rockefeller Center. In contrast to his shy, divided parent, Nelson regarded his name not as a burden, but as a benchmark. Not content to redeem the family legend, he would create one of his own. His contradictions do not end there. The most tactile politician of his generation hated to be touched himself and steadfastly refused to kiss babies. He also refused to autograph blank checks, which were frequently thrust in his face. The quintessential pragmatist proved the most unyielding advocate of fallout shelters and punitive drug laws. Denounced as a party wrecker, he refused to switch political allegiances, even for the presidency. An extrovert, happiest in the world of artistic contemplation, a pillar of the American establishment who was more comfortable playing the renegade, all his life, Nelson Rockefeller went against the grain. It was a trait first displayed at the family dinner table, where his controlling father tied a rubber band to his son's hand, yanking it whenever Nelson favored his left hand. At Dartmouth, the young man invited catcalls. Imagine, it took guts. First of all, Nelson loved Dartmouth. I cannot overstress how much he loved this place. He loved it when he was here, and he loved it even more after he was here. There was a Dartmouth mafia that he surrounded himself with, every bit as much as Kennedy's Irish mafia or the sun-tanned Californians around Ronald Reagan. He loved this place. But he did say one thing. It's very interesting. Of course, there were no women at Dartmouth in those days, and he had come from the Lincoln School, a progressive school funded and really founded by his father in New York, which had been co-ed. And he said he missed the sensitivity of that environment, the sensitivity that comes from having both sexes as part of the educational exercise. So anyway, he volunteered to teach little girls Sunday school at the church, the white church here. Now, here's what took guts. By the way, Abby was so happy she sent him 2 pounds of kumquats to share with the little girls. Anyway, but here's Nelson. Here's the walking contradiction. Okay, here's Nelson, this exquisitely sensitive soul, who courageously is spending his Sunday mornings teaching little girls the Bible. And when it's over, he takes them by the hand and he walks, past the inn. Well, that's where the guts came in, because, of course, his less devoted or selfless or sensitive classmates found this a great occasion to hoot and catcall and the like. Well, anyway, Nelson is what I call the sensitive pugilist, because one Sunday he was pushed beyond endurance and he knocked a classmate down in front of these little girls whom he'd been teaching all about biblical virtues, but that was an important lesson too. In the 1930s, he displayed elbows just as sharp in finding tenants for Rockefeller Center. There's a reason why in the 1930s they called the Empire State Building the empty State Building. All of those folks were at Rockefeller Center. And the main reason they were at Rockefeller Center was because of this young, extraordinarily aggressive promoter. Competitors accused him of emulating old John D. at his most piratical. What they meant as an insult, Nelson took as a compliment. On the other hand, traditionalists at the Standard companies resented his earnest lay sermons about justifying wealth before multiplying wealth. In New Deal Washington, the fresh-faced, first-time bureaucrat managed to outmaneuver veterans like Cordell Hull and Wild Bill Donovan. Their displeasure was shared by John Foster Dulles and the tight-fisted managers of the Eisenhower White House. Heedless of consequences, no sooner had he been elected governor in 1958 than he anticipated John Kennedy's call to get this country moving again by publicly assailing Dwight Eisenhower's defense policies. It's hard to imagine today what a gutsy or maybe foolhardy thing that was to do. Ike was still an enormously popular president with total credibility, particularly where the military was concerned. And Nelson Rockefeller, coming off of the brothers-funded the series of special studies, believed, as indeed did John F. Kennedy and many others, that looking down the road, and that's what he did all his life. You have to remember, Nelson. Most politicians are incrementalists. They live in the here and now. They congratulate themselves if they prevent things from getting worse. Nelson Rockefeller lived 10, 20, 30 years in the future. I think that's a key to understanding the kind of leader he was, and why, in many ways, he's out of fashion. But he'll come back. Through it all, Rockefeller persisted in his headstrong ways, and why not? Through rigorous application, he'd overcome dyslexia to earn a Phi Beta Kappa key here at Dartmouth. At the organizing conference of the United Nations in San Francisco, he'd stared down Dulles, the Soviet delegation, and most of his own country's representatives to enact Article 51. Now, you probably don't know, Article 51 made it possible for NATO to exist. That was Nelson Rockefeller's insistence against great odds. In 1958, his most trusted advisor, Frank Jameson, counseled against running for governor against Averill Harriman in what looked to be a certain Democratic year. As a consolation prize, Tom Dewey condescendingly offered to make him postmaster of New York City. Rockefeller defied the kingmakers and snatched the crown for himself. In 1966 and again in 1970, he was informed that voters were sick of him. His taxes, his bond issues, his endless initiatives, even the sight of his face on television. Both times, he came from behind in textbook campaigns that remade the face of modern American politics. To this day, the best political commercials that have ever been created were those that sold Governor Rockefeller in 1966. They included the talking fish that talked about how he had cleaned up the Hudson River. There was the wonderful luau music while it was pointed out that Governor Rockefeller had built enough roads to go all the way to Hawaii and back. In any event, they are masterpieces of concision and substance and, yes, wit. And when is the last time you could say any of those things about a political commercial? Finally, in the last year of his life, the art establishment reacted with horror to his populist notion of making quality reproductions available to the general public. He plunged ahead, earning almost $1 million, and planning on the day he died to announce an expansion of the Nelson Rockefeller Collection, Inc. Because he told friends he never looked back, it's often assumed he never looked within. But listen to the following. From a letter he wrote to his mother in March 1933, he was 24 at the time, a new husband and father, destined to inherit a great fortune, and groping for a purpose to match his prospects. Dear Mum, I find life just as perplexing and pointless as Lawrence does, only as I have a driving force in me and a happy-go-lucky nature, I keep on going. A great many things that I do, I question. 1, I agree with you that I talk too much about the family and that I lack sympathy. These 2 points I will try and correct. 2, I don't agree with you that I should talk more about myself and what I'm doing. I make a definite effort not to, as it would probably be exceedingly boring, and talking about oneself is man's greatest weakness and a sign of conceit. Lord knows I have enough trouble fighting down conceit. 3, I think that you give me too much credit when you say you don't think that I really am heard and unfeeling. I'm sorry to say that I'm both of these, not naturally, but by schooling myself to be. That sounds strange, but I think it is true. It is a result of my overpowering ambition. If one is going to get very far in this world, one must be impersonal and not waste one's emotional strength on irrelevant things. Probably if I were a little more humble, it would solve a good many questions. Anyway, I'll make an effort, and I do appreciate your letter. If I saw the point of it all, it would be somewhat simpler. But who knows? I may someday. Don't worry, Mum. We'll all stick together anyway. Your devoted bad boy, Nelson. P.S. I bought a swell blue hippopotamus by Carl Walters from Mrs. Halpert. Wait until you see it! Exclamation mark. There, in that postscript, is the real Nelson Rockefeller. That's where he lets down his guard. No longer the coolly analytical bystander taking his own emotional temperature. He gives full rein to his natural exuberance. His enthusiasms would frequently supersede his detachment, especially where art was concerned. Nelson needs art more than any man I know, said his friend Alfred Burr. All kinds of art, Burr might have added, primitive and modern, pre-Columbian and Andy Warhol, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Iranian, European, Mexican pottery, and Eskimo reindeer, totem poles and Rodin bronzes, Calder mobiles and Tiffany lamps, Japanese prints, and African folk art. I talked to Mark Hatfield, his fellow governor and moderate Republican, and he told me the wonderful story about visiting on Fifth Avenue and being given a tour through the triplex and seeing all of this extraordinary art. And when it was over, he said, Nelson, I'm blown away. I've never seen anything like this. But I'd be curious, could you tell me, of all your collections, which is the one that gives you the most pleasure? And he said, that's easy. It's my china. He said, you know, Mark, sometimes I get up in the middle of the night just to set the table. In the late 1950s, the late R.W. Johnny Apple, long a mainstay at the New York Times, but then employed by the Wall Street Journal, briefly dated the governor's daughter, Mary. He recounted for me his very first visit to the Rockefeller apartment. Quote, I got off the elevator and the first thing I see is the bird in flight of Brancusi, right there. And he says, how are you? You like art? I said, oh yeah, yes I do, very much. Without a word to Mary or anything else, he went down and then took a right, and there was a full room with the kinds of things they have in study collections. Those big sliding walls on rollers. You pull one out and there were 8 or 10 pictures on it. And they were amazing things. I said, these things just sit in here unless somebody comes in and you roll them out? He said, out of walls. Apple couldn't help himself. I said, 4 or 5 houses and you're out of walls? He said, I've been out of walls for years. No wonder Todd Rockefeller once said of her husband's proliferating collections, which eventually numbered 16,000 objects. These boxes kept coming in, and I never know what to do about them. The 1950s were a difficult time for Nelson Rockefeller. In Eisenhower's Washington, he was close to power, but he had little of his own. So when depressed, he would summon René Dartmouth, whom he had installed as director of the Museum of Modern Art, to fly to the nation's capital with a suitcase full of Peruvian gold objects d'art, to cheer him up, in Dartmouth's words. Others found his passion literally mystifying. One upstate lawmaker, invited for drinks and discussions at Albany's ramshackle executive mansion, planted himself before an abstract painting more vivid than coherent. Finally, it came to him, quote, that's the way the world looked to me on the day I discovered sex, he observed. Rockefeller's reaction is unknown but imaginable. Not long before he died, he confessed disappointment at having to explain his challenging possessions to the uninitiated. Art didn't lend itself to explanation. Art was something to be felt, and felt differently according to one's mood or outlook. In other words, it wasn't ultimately the artist who defined the work, but its owner. For Nelson Rockefeller, art was simultaneously spiritual and sensual. Above all else, it existed on his terms. More than once, I've been tempted to call my book Nothing in Moderation. Another paradox, because after all, Nelson Rockefeller is synonymous with moderate republicanism. In candid moments, he readily confessed that he did most things to excess. As a protege of George Hinman, familiar name around here, and the governor's longtime ambassador to the national GOP, Bobby Douglas recalled for me a plane trip during which the governor showed off his taste for life's finer things. Nelson's looking at a bunch of pictures in a folder. He said, George, what do you think of this? Here's this absolutely beautiful jet, a Lockheed Jetstar or something. And George said, well, that's very nice. The governor would say, look at the design of this, and toss over another picture. It was a Ferrari. And George says, it's a beautiful car. And then he tossed over another picture of a boat. And George says, well, Nelson, why don't you buy the Jetstar, and then you get the Ferrari, he said, and then you buy the boat, and then you can decide it's time to no longer be governor of New York State. And Nelson said, well, I could drive the Ferrari around Kaikit. In much the same spirit, his penchant for self-medication was notorious among friends. His osteopath, Ken Ryland, once said, it's a good thing he never went into medicine. Press Secretary Hugh Morrow joked, after we got that drug law passed, the first guy who's going to get arrested is Nelson Rockefeller. The owner of 5 homes and all those pieces of art was not generously endowed with irony. Rockefeller instructed Albert Schweitzer on the dysentery-fighting properties of sofa with the same brass-plated assurance that prompted him to move furniture in strangers' houses and once rearrange a sound system installed by the Shah of Iran. But again, it was the dyslexia and the visual intelligence and the need to control his environment. I've talked to people who said literally it was almost impossible for him, even in Kaiket, to walk through a room and not adjust a picture or move an ashtray just a fraction of an inch. He had that kind of eye. This may have been genetic, befitting a family that provided its offspring when young with a $500,000 playhouse in the French Normandy style, along with weekly allowances of 50 cents. Having been drilled from an early age in the virtues of self-denial, the adult Rockefeller resolved to instill similar qualities in his young sons, Nelson and Mark. He said as much one day when he interrupted an environmental briefing in Albany to ask, "What are phosphates?" "Governor, that's something used in dishwashers." "Well," said Rockefeller, "I use one of these little mops." "Governor," asked one brave staffer, "you wash dishes?" "Sure," he responded as they looked on slack-jawed. "When the boys and I go to camp, we each take turns washing dishes. It's part of teaching them self-reliance." At which point everyone in the room exploded in laughter. As a small boy attending the decidedly progressive Lincoln School, to which his parents sent him in preference to more traditional establishments, Nelson Rockefeller was heard to ask one teacher, "What are we going to learn today that's new?" It was a question he never stopped asking. If he recalls anyone, it is, I think, an earlier governor of New York, about whom we heard yesterday, and about whom, revealingly, he chose to reminisce on his very last day as governor in December 1973. That the most notorious of all Theodore Roosevelt's famed malefactors of wealth happened to be John D. Rockefeller had not prevented Roosevelt from becoming a family friend or from spellbinding John D.'s grandsons with rousing tales of African safaris. Nelson characteristically wanted to know more, specifically how it was that TR had managed to get a long-necked giraffe into a railroad car for the long journey home. 4 years after he split the Republican Party, opening fissures which remain unhealed to this day, the Rough Rider renewed his interest in the presidency, but only, he said, if the American people were in a heroic mood. Yet for all his noisy exuberance and progressive aura, Theodore Roosevelt at heart was a thoughtful conservative, a pragmatic product of Manhattan's brownstones who balanced budgets and threw open the windows of a musty society to forestall violent changes. Roosevelt understood that unregulated monopoly could pose a greater threat than unrestrained government, not least because it encouraged radical tendencies among those exploited by economic predators. He serves his party best, argued TR, who most helps to make it instantly responsive to every need of the people. Nelson Rockefeller said much the same thing in more personal language. When you stop to think of it, he once mused, who has more to conserve than I do? Like the first Roosevelt to go into politics, the first Rockefeller to seek office invited caricature. Yet he was too large to fit any single label. Entrepreneur, philanthropist, statesman, patron of the arts, outdoorsman, frustrated architect, geopolitical strategist, urban planner, and for 15 years the dominant figure on the second most important political stage in the land. The parallels do not end there. Just as TR displayed a reckless courage in challenging the conservative goals of his party, so Nelson Rockefeller found himself torn between conviction and ambition. More loyal to his party than many of his fiercest critics on the right, Rockefeller was nevertheless typecast unfairly as a political spoilsport. From an early age, he had learned to manipulate people, above all, his high-minded father, applying the same charm, persuasion, and occasionally guile, later used to cajole tax increases disguised as fees out of the New York State legislature. But charm has its limits, especially in the dangerous back alleys of New York politics. Had he been poor, his aide Jim Cannon told me, he would have been the best barroom street fighter on the Lower East Side. As evidence, Cannon described an impending visit to Washington at a critical juncture in Rockefeller's fight to secure revenue sharing. The fact of the matter is he needed $500 million to plug a hole in the New York State budget in the early 1970s. And he came up with the idea of revenue sharing. Then he had to sell it, needless to say. Now, why was there a $500 million? Well, the governor liked ideas. He liked big ideas. And if the big ideas had a big price tag, That was something he was perfectly willing to live with. How many times in those 15 years in Albany did this conversation or some variation of it occur? Occasionally, someone on the staff, someone especially new or particularly brave, would pipe up and say, "Governor, it's a great idea, but the problem is money." To which he would shoot back, "No, the solution is money. The problem is, how do we get the money?" By the early 70s, the problem and the solution had become one. So that's the origin of federal revenue sharing. Well, to members of Congress, who were, of course, accustomed to doling out federal largesse themselves, this was a concept both exotic and menacing. As Cannon explained it to the governor, virtually every member of his state's congressional delegation was opposed to revenue sharing. "Great," replied the governor, grinning broadly. "Let's you and I go down and take them all on." Never was this combative streak more memorably displayed than at his party's 1964 convention. The book opens with the amazing scene of Tuesday night at the Republican convention, when those who are in charge of the convention, first of all, are doing everything they can to delay, first of all, letting Nelson Rockefeller come to the stage. They get Ike out of retirement to give a speech. They read the entire 15,000-word platform, figuring that'll take 90 minutes, and by the time the governor comes up, at least it won't be prime time in the East. No one who saw him commanding the podium in the Cow Palace, his jaw jutting out like the prow of a dreadnought, taunting his enemies while confirming his harshest allegations about their alleged extremism, is ever likely to forget the scene. The next morning, the governor encountered his press secretary, Hugh Morrow, appearing more than slightly the worse for wear. "You look like the wrath of God," he told Morrow. "Frankly," Morrow said, "I went out last night and got drunk." "What for?" asked Rockefeller. "I enjoyed every minute of it." Though true, this was hardly the whole truth. Facing down the newly ascendant Goldwaterites, Rockefeller later confided to an aide, for the first time in his life, he felt like hitting someone. He must have forgotten that incident on Sunday morning here at Dartmouth. He very nearly acted on the impulse. When the convention's presiding officer, Senator Thurston Norton, tried not so gently to usher him off the stage before his 5 minutes were up, Rockefeller put his hand over a live microphone. "If Morton didn't back off," said the speaker, even as the hall resounded to cries of "We want Barry," "I'll deck you right here in front of everyone." He finished his 5 minutes. Until now, the sheer drama of that confrontation has largely obscured all that Barry Goldwater's Republican Party that night was rejecting. Not only Nelson Rockefeller, but the family and the culture, which for most of a century had done battle against fundamentalists of one kind or another. Who was it, after all, who built Riverside Church as a hymn to modern ecumenism, replacing the saints of old with stony images of Darwin and Booker T. Washington? Who had made the health of Southern sharecroppers part of the national agenda? Who preached global interdependence and the gospel of population control long before either one was fashionable? In politics as in art, it was Nelson Rockefeller's fate to be surrounded by primitives. Nor was that the worst of it. Even while he lived, some journalists emphasized the defeats he suffered over the victories he gained. Bill Ronan, whose title of Secretary of the Governor only hinted at the pivotal role that he played throughout the governorship and beyond, was once asked to explain the on-again, off-again pursuit of the White House by his boss. His response was the candle and the moth. Others resorted to Freudian theories. Longtime personal secretary Ian Whitman believed that Rockefeller, in fact, harbored doubts about his capacity for the job. The courtly George Hinman attributed his patron's zigzag course to having been exposed at an impressionable age to Franklin D. Roosevelt, a daunting role model whose shadow he never fully escaped. What all this overlooks, of course, are factors beyond any man's control. Long before Nelson Rockefeller burst on the national political scene, the forces that had nominated Willkie, Dewey, and Eisenhower were largely spent. They were yielding control to the South and the West in the party. It wasn't simply that he was born too late, More than a victim of timing, he was a victim of his own temperament. Wooing a party distrustful of government, he held that the surest way to become president was to demonstrate a genius for governing. Having the best ideas, the most creative programs, the most talented associates might gain him endorsement from the New York Times and the State Labor Council. It gave him license to poach on black, Hispanic, and other ethnic voters off limits to more conventional Republicans. Yet his very success at home alienated Rockefeller from the national GOP, whose heart, as early as 1968, I would argue, belonged to Ronald Reagan, even as its head dutifully nodded in the direction of Richard Nixon. Following Nixon's narrow first ballot nomination in Miami, a radio reporter asked the governor why a political party hungry for victory had never seen fit to anoint one of its biggest vote-getters. Rockefeller arched the most expressive eyebrows in American politics. "Have you ever been to a Republican convention?" he replied. Pressed on why he hadn't simply changed his party registration, he invariably replied he would much rather be pushing the GOP elephant forward than holding the Democratic donkey back. Shrewd self-knowledge. He pursued power, as most other things, on his own terms, all of which led Bob Hartman, who was in the Ford White House, one of his friends and allies. We just lost him a week ago at the age of 91. He was the man who wrote Our Long National Nightmare Is Over. And he became a great friend and great fan of Nelson Rockefeller's in the White House. And he said something very, very shrewd. He took the old Henry Clay line and he turned it inside out. And he said he would rather be Nelson Rockefeller than president. To many, he seems a quasi-tragic figure, all but consumed by the pursuit of the presidency. In fact, he was anything but single-minded. Listen to his campaign strategist, John Deardorff, recalling the 1964 Oregon primary he won, by the way, during which Nelson Rockefeller juggled his Albany duties with a punishing schedule of West Coast appearances. And in those days, going to Oregon and back, well, I mean, first of all, you had to stop in Nebraska to refuel. I mean, it was a major effort. Anyway, returning one night aboard his F-27 Wayfarer, Rockefeller retreated to the tail of the plane, which had been reconfigured to include a bed for the candidate who preferred reading art catalogs to briefing books. "So we're on our way back from Portland," says Deardorff. "It's probably 1 a.m. Eastern time and just about everybody else is asleep. But I'm not. So I'm sitting with my little reading light on." He said, "Johnny." I look around, and he's sitting like a potentate with his legs crossed, and he's got his bathrobe on, and he's in the back of the plane. He says, "Come back here." He's got something spread out in front of him. I go back, and I get on the bed next to him, and he's got the plans for the Albany Mall. And he proceeds to spend 2 hours telling me about what this is going to look like and how important this is going to be to the architecture world and how this is going to give Albany a kind of class that it has never had. It's going to be the most important capital in the world. And he goes on and on and on. I'm 20 or 25,000 feet in the air. We're chugging along in this thing. And here I am at age 31. I'm sitting with Nelson Rockefeller in his bathrobe, in his airplane. And he gives me the whole story of what this Albany Mall is going to look like when he gets the legislature to approve the money. And it's clearly as important to him as the trip we were just completing. And there are two things about that, concluded Deardorff. One is, first of all, it confirms the love of architecture and his love of these monumental things. And I don't know that he even saw it as a monument to himself. I don't think he did. It was almost like a fallback position. It was something he could have loved no matter what. And I always thought, and I still do think, that for him, unlike a Nixon, for example, the presidency was not the ultimate prize. He said this one time, "They're going to take me like a hammer, or they're not going to take me." He was going to be president on his own terms. That's the way he felt about Happy and that whole relationship. It was willful. It was a sign of the size of his ego that he could say it, but he meant it. It wasn't phony. If they think I got something to give them, and they like what I'm talking about, if they like the ideas, okay. If not, so what? And that's something to remember and maybe contrast with the current campaign. And I'm not pointing a finger at any candidate or any party. One major reason why Nelson Rockefeller, in my opinion, never became president because there was a fundamental disconnect between what kind of president he wanted to be and the corresponding naive notion that a campaign for president was an educational exercise. It wasn't supposed to be about trivia and distractions and what ministers say, or if you misremembered trips to Bosnia. It was supposed to be about ideas and programs. In 1964, he had positions on 400 issues, and he could tell you all 400, from the space program to U.S. relations with Thailand. And they were his ideas. And that's why he ran for president, to get ideas out into the public, to convince the American people that this was worth doing. Just as in his first year as governor, when he decided in order to have any kind of program, he had to raise taxes. He'd just been elected. He's a multimillionaire candidate. You can't imagine a more difficult or unpopular or politically challenging thing to do, and yet he did it. And in the end, he got the taxes, he got the program. That was the origin of the State University of New York, and so much more. And he demonstrated a very old-fashioned concept, which is, don't run for president just because you like to campaign. Don't be president if you think you're never going to have to make tough, politically unpopular decisions that cost you. He was a fundamentally constructive force in American politics. That's how he governed in New York. That's how he campaigned for the presidency. And in my opinion, that's the kind of president he would have been. There is one final reason why he was fundamentally out of sync with the Republican Party as it was evolving in the 1960s. Stu Spencer, who was this wonderful, gruff, sort of cigar-chewing political consultant from California, told me at one low point in the California primary, and there were many, they started out way behind. In any event, at one point he says, Governor, I think it's time to call in the Eastern establishment. And Rocky says, you're looking at it, buddy. I'm all that's left. Self-knowledge. But anyway, Stu Spencer also told me a story, even more revealing, about him and about the party. He was in San Diego, which is Goldwater country, and he was in a room full of elderly, blue-haired ladies, all of whom were passionately for Barry, and who thought he probably had horns. And he came into the room for a breakfast meeting, and by sheer charm and charisma, he had actually managed to melt the ice. And they were actually warming up to him. They were in danger of maybe even considering voting for him. And then, just when he had sort of turned the key, out of the corner of an eye, he saw a black waiter who was removing dishes. And something clicked. He had been told, whatever you do, don't mention open housing. A referendum on that combustible subject was on the primary ballot, and needless to say, endorsing it would not win him many votes in the Republican primary. He saw this waiter, and something, as I say, happened, and he started talking about open housing and how important it was for people of all races and creeds and backgrounds to live as neighbors in the same neighborhood. And on and on and on, and you could feel the temperature falling, in the room. And as soon as he was done, he got onto the plane, and Stu Spencer gets on with this look, and the governor says, I guess I really screwed up, didn't I? And Spencer told me, but you know what? He did not sound the least bit contrite. Which brings me to a final surprise, maybe the most historically significant of all, hinted at in a casual remark he made in January 1971. Richard Nixon had just delivered his third State of the Union address, a document bearing unmistakable similarities to Nelson Rockefeller's fourth inaugural address. Perhaps, Rockefeller told a friend, without bitterness, perhaps this is my real role in politics. He might never be president himself, but he would surely help to set the nation's agenda. Stop and think how he set the nation's agenda. The most undiplomatic of diplomats, in standing up to the foreign policy establishment at San Francisco and elsewhere, he had laid the groundwork to oppose Soviet expansionism. Through his International Basic Economy Corporation, he recreated American foreign policy and foreign aid programs, including Point 4, which Harry Truman entrusted to his oversight. Invited by President Eisenhower to reorganize the federal establishment, he invented the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, added 10 million people to Social Security, took away the notion that as soon as those Republicans come back into power, it's going to be back to Herbert Hoover. By the way, he didn't stop there. It's extraordinary how the seeds that he planted bore fruit years and years later. It wasn't until 1967 that his idea for a federal Department of Transportation came into existence. It was a gathering of experts assembled under his leadership that produced Ike's groundbreaking Open Skies proposal that placed the Soviets on the propaganda defensive. I've already mentioned the special studies. The fact is the Rockefeller brothers' special studies supplied a blueprint for presidents of both parties throughout the 1960s. Guess where the phrase, the new frontier, originated? As governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller redefined states' rights to mean states' responsibilities, with profound implications for 21st century America. His Pure Waters program, like the Adirondack State Park, and a host of other environmental initiatives stamped him as an unlikely tree hugger. John Kennedy might be lionized for the glittering artists who filled his White House, but it was Nelson Rockefeller who insisted against great odds and occasional ridicule that the state, spelled first with a small s and then with a capital one, should support the creative impulse. Why do you think we have a National Endowment for the Arts or a National Endowment for the Humanities? Because Nelson Rockefeller insisted in 1959 that New York State would be the first state in the Union to have a state council on the arts. Call him a fiscal Hamiltonian, but in one crucial aspect, he was a Jeffersonian of the purest stripe. Architecture is my delight, vowed the sage of Monticello, and putting up and pulling down one of my favorite amusements, which brings me to a final parallel between the artist and the politician. For each, creativity comes at the price of criticism. The more audacious the vision, the more predictable the assault. In the words of Robert Browning, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? Once I asked one of his oldest friends to describe Governor Rockefeller's religious beliefs, and he replied, as others have, in almost the same words, he expected to meet his mother in heaven. Biographers are not theologians. However, if Nelson Rockefeller's spiritual vision has been realized, I have no doubt that mother and son, accompanied by Michael, are striding enthusiastically through some celestial gallery. Their faces wear a look of rapture over the latest exhibition of the avant-garde, mingled with conspiratorial glee as they plan to shield their newest purchases from a disapproving junior. It goes without saying that the governor is out of wall space. Meanwhile, the unopened crates are piling up, enough to occupy the most acquisitive of collectors for ages to come. But then Nelson Rockefeller always took the long view. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very kind. And we got a few minutes, and we can do a few questions. Comments, observations, constructive criticism. It's all, okay? And just raise a hand. Yep.
You talked about his concern about being touched. And how does that explain the big bear hug and the hiya fella?
Oh, I know. Well, it was on his terms. No, and the great Latin American Abrazo, he was a Latin. He loved South America. He was in his element in South America. He loved going out in the fields and talking to campesinos. And I mean, he really, really emotionally connected with Latin Americans. And there were lots of hugs, but, he initiated them. And again, I tell you my source. It's a former Secret Service agent and 2 former campaign aides, both of whom, one of their function was basically, to kind of hang back and just, make sure that people didn't get too close. And yep. Oh, okay, over there. Yeah.
I'm a little curious about Rockefeller was extremely hawkish when it came to foreign policy.
I'm sorry?
Rockefeller was extremely hawkish when it came to foreign policy. You mentioned his displeasure with the parsimonious budget, the defense budgets of the Eisenhower administration.
Yeah.
Most of his the Munich agreement, the Fifth Avenue Compromise with Nixon in 1960,
Right.
was getting Nixon to agree to bigger defense budgets
And civil rights.
and civil rights. But was that the kicker in the Republican dismay with Rockefeller?
Well, that's a good question. The fact is, in the Eisenhower White House, for example, he was all set to become Secretary of Defense in the later part of the administration. It was all set. And then the budget hawks and the people around Dulles, the real fiscal conservatives, basically revolted and said, he spends money like a Democrat. And the nomination was withdrawn. The fact is, he was Franklin Roosevelt's, protege, and he was a New York Republican, which meant very much in the tradition of Theodore Roosevelt or Tom Dewey, who in fact was very much someone who accommodated the New Deal. So he was seen as maybe the word accommodationist. Now the great irony is, throughout his public career, he was very frustrated. He would go to meetings of Republican delegates, true believers, conservatives, and he'd say, I don't understand what the problem is you have with me, because, I'm strong on defense, I'm militantly anti-communist. No one believes stronger than I do in a robust private sector. So, why can't you give me the domestic, programs? If Nelson Rockefeller had not existed, he would have had to have been invented. I mean, those people needed a lightning rod, and in many ways he fulfilled that role. But you are right. But even there are gradations. In 1968, for example, he understood that Vietnam was going nowhere, and he and Henry Kissinger, who was more hawkish than he was, but he understood the need to find a way to negotiate an end to the Vietnam War. He also, interestingly enough, because Richard Nixon, quite understandably, gets the credit for going to China, but even before Nixon's 1967 article in Foreign Affairs in which he sort of talked about China, Nelson Rockefeller was privately talking about an opening to China. And again, some of that may have been Kissinger, but also remember, the Rockefeller family's ties to China were very long-standing. The college and medical school that they'd opened in Beijing, early in the 20th century, and I mean they had, he understood the world. I think that what we really lost when Nelson Rockefeller didn't become president was someone who was cosmopolitan enough to understand other people on their terms without in any way conceding our interests. And I think that's a pretty attractive model for an American president in very complicated times.
But his 1969 trip to South America was a catastrophe.
It was a catastrophe. It was also, in many ways, a personal tragedy. He was told he couldn't go to Venezuela. And, of course, he had, the ranch in Venezuela. And he had invested hugely in Venezuela, not to make a profit, but, during the war and after the war, to demonstrate the capitalism cared about people who had basically been neglected by their own government. So there is great irony, and there's no doubt. That trip was a terribly painful trip. He never whined, he never complained. I think he was more frustrated that Richard Nixon put the report on the shelf when he came back. And I think, to be honest with you, and I think it's entirely possible Richard Nixon sent him in the first place to sort of keep him out of his hair during the first year of his presidency.
We're going to take one last question.
Yeah. Yeah.
What president is Rockefeller most like?
Without a doubt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Ebullient, optimistic, loving every day of life and of the job. FDR, I think, was more unknowable. FDR spoke to millions as my friends and had almost no real friends. I think he was more distant in that sense. But I think there's no doubt that FDR took to Nelson Rockefeller. I mean, I think almost the first time they met. He saw in himself, even the flattery, the shameless flattery. I mean, if you look at young Roosevelt in his sort of callow days, I mean, he was, you can see the makings of the mature Roosevelt, but he's a pretty bumptious character. And I think he looked at Nelson Rockefeller and he saw, in many ways, a younger version of himself. Nelson Rockefeller loved ideas. And, you know, if he had 100 ideas a day, that was wonderful. You know, if one of them turned out to be really valid. And that sense of intellectual exuberance, I think, reflected very much the way FDR approached governing. And I also think Nelson himself said he learned a lot about administration from Franklin Roosevelt. That, you know, conservatives and Republican businessmen always excoriate FDR then and now for not doing things in a business-like way. You know, the old line was he'd appoint 3 people to do one job or one person to do the job of 3 people. Rockefeller was very observant, and he spent a lot of time in the Roosevelt White House. And he watched, he saw, as a student of power, he watched what the president did, and he understood. He understood that, first of all, FDR didn't like personal confrontations. He understood how government operated, and if you were going to be, quote, rational and businesslike, you had no place in the federal government. If you had someone who was well-meaning but not up to the job, you had 2 choices. You could get rid of him with all the hurt feelings and consequences, or you could ignore him and have someone else do the job. And the fact of the matter is, it worked pretty well. I guess we won World War II and ended the Depression and transformed the presidency. And I think it's very interesting. In 1970, when the Eleanor Roosevelt Wing was added and dedicated at the Hyde Park, at the Roosevelt Library, Governor Rockefeller, who, by the way, was physically fearless, he walked away. I've documented at least 3 plane crashes that he walked away from in his life. And he was in a helicopter, and thunderstorms, very menacing weather. Everyone said, "You can't go." And he said, "I'm going." And he got there, 15 minutes before the ceremony ended, because he wanted to pay tribute to the man who was, in many ways, his patron. He had an autographed picture. He had a picture of his son, Michael, on his desk. And nearby, he had an autographed photo of FDR. And anyone who saw it, he said, "Oh, he was a great man. He was a great man." And you could hear in his voice all the years rolled away, and those very eventful coming of age experience under the master. Imagine being tutored in politics by Franklin D. Roosevelt. So that's his mentor. Thank you again, everyone.